The sleek black Mercedes pulled into the park's parking lot at exactly 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, and Victor Ashford sat behind the wheel watching his 9-year-old daughter Emma through the tinted windows, his phone pressed to his ear as another business call demanded his attention, another crisis that apparently only he could solve. He'd promised to take Emma to the park himself today, no nanny, no assistant, just father and daughter like she'd begged for. But even now he couldn't fully disconnect from the empire that had consumed every corner of his life. That's when he saw her, the homeless girl who couldn't have been more than 16, sitting cross-legged on a patch of grass near the playground, and what he witnessed in the next 60 seconds would shatter every assumption he'd built his life upon and force him to confront the kind of poverty that existed not in spreadsheets or charitable reports but in the breathing, suffering reality of a child who'd been failed by every system designed to protect her. Emma had wandered away from the swings, drawn by something Victor couldn't initially see, and when he ended his call abruptly and stepped out of the car to follow her, he found his daughter sitting beside the homeless girl, both of them bent over a battered notebook, the older girl's finger tracing words on a page while Emma listened with the kind of rapt attention she never gave her expensive tutors. The homeless girl wore clothes that were dirty and torn, layers that couldn't possibly provide enough warmth for the autumn chill, her hair matted and tangled, her face smudged with grime, but her eyes were bright with intelligence as she read aloud from what Victor realized was a worn copy of a classic novel, her voice clear and articulate despite the circumstances that had clearly beaten her down in every other way. She was teaching Emma, explaining the story with the passion of someone who loved literature despite having nothing, who'd somehow maintained her education and her dignity even as the world had stripped away everything else. Victor stood frozen, watching this scene unfold with a growing sense of discomfort that bordered on shame. His daughter, who had every advantage money could buy, who attended the most prestigious private school in the city, who had a library at home filled with first editions and leather-bound collections, was utterly captivated by this homeless teenager reading from a book so damaged its pages were held together with tape and hope. Emma was asking questions about the characters, about their motivations, about themes and symbolism, the kind of engaged learning Victor had spent thousands on tutors to cultivate, and this girl with nothing was providing it freely on a patch of grass in a public park, sharing the wealth of knowledge that couldn't be taken from her even when everything else had been. If you're watching this and you believe that wisdom isn't determined by wealth, that every person has value regardless of their circumstances, that true education comes from passion rather than privilege, please hit that like button right now, leave a comment sharing a time when someone unexpected taught you something valuable, share this story with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to this channel because we all need reminders that the most important lessons often come from the most unlikely teachers. Victor approached slowly, not wanting to startle them, and when Emma looked up and saw him, her face lit with an excitement he rarely witnessed anymore, the kind of pure joy that had become scarce in their carefully scheduled, achievement-oriented life. She introduced him to Lily, explained that Lily knew all about books and stories, that she'd been teaching her about Jane Eyre and why it was important to be strong even when the world was cruel to you. Lily stood up quickly, defensive and wary, clearly expecting to be shooed away, to be told she didn't belong in this nice park where wealthy families brought their children, that her presence was unwelcome and possibly criminal. Victor saw the way she gathered the few possessions she had, a backpack that looked ready to fall apart, preparing to leave before she was forced to, and something in her dignified acceptance of rejection struck him as profoundly wrong. He asked her to wait, to stay, said he didn't mean to interrupt, and Lily looked at him with the exhausted suspicion of someone who'd learned that adults rarely kept their word, that kindness was usually a prelude to disappointment. Victor found himself asking how she knew so much about literature, where she'd learned to teach with such obvious skill, and Lily's story emerged in quiet fragments, pieces of a tragedy that should never have happened in a country as wealthy as this one. She'd been a straight-A student, had dreams of becoming an English teacher, had a scholarship lined up for college, but when her mother died suddenly from an undiagnosed heart condition 2 years ago and her father spiraled into addiction and violence, the system that should have caught her had instead let her fall through cracks wide enough to swallow futures. She'd spent time in foster care that was more abusive than her father's house, had run away to protect herself, had been living on the streets for 8 months now, sleeping in shelters when she could get a bed, in doorways when she couldn't, eating at soup kitchens and from dumpsters behind restaurants. But she'd kept her books, the ones she'd owned before everything fell apart, carried them in her backpack like treasures because they were the only things connecting her to who she'd been, to who she still hoped she might become. She read every day, taught herself from discarded textbooks she found in library donation bins, maintained her education because it was the one thing no one could take from her, the one form of wealth that didn't require a bank account or an address. Victor listened with a growing sense of horror and recognition. He'd built his fortune in real estate, owned properties across 3 states, had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, and yet he'd been blind to the reality that people like Lily existed not in distant countries or abstract statistics but right here in his own city, sleeping on streets his Mercedes drove past every day. He'd donated to charities, attended galas, written checks that looked generous in photographs, all while maintaining a careful distance from the actual faces of homelessness, from the real human cost of a society that created billionaires and discarded children with equal efficiency. Emma was tugging on his sleeve, asking if Lily could come home with them, if she could keep teaching her about books, and Victor saw in his daughter's eyes a clarity he'd lost somewhere in his climb to the top, the simple understanding that a person's worth had nothing to do with their address. He made a decision then that surprised himself, invited Lily to join them for dinner, not at some restaurant where her appearance would draw stares and judgment, but at their home where they could talk properly, where he could understand how someone so obviously intelligent and capable had ended up in such desperate circumstances. Lily's resistance was immediate and fierce. She didn't want charity, didn't want to be someone's project or good deed for the day, had learned that accepting help often came with expectations she couldn't meet, with conditions that turned assistance into manipulation. Victor recognized the pride in her refusal, the determination to maintain dignity even in degradation, and found himself respecting it even as he tried to find words that would convince her this wasn't pity but something else, something he couldn't quite name but desperately needed to understand. He told her he wasn't offering charity but an opportunity, that Emma clearly connected with her teaching in ways his expensive tutors had failed to achieve, that he'd pay her properly for tutoring services if she'd be willing to provide them. Lily laughed bitterly at that, asked how she was supposed to tutor anyone when she didn't have an address, couldn't pass a background check, probably smelled like the shelter she'd stayed in last night. Victor felt the full weight of the barriers society had constructed, the way homelessness became a self-perpetuating trap, how losing your address meant losing access to jobs, to identification, to the basic building blocks of stability that everyone else took for granted. The 3 of them sat at the park as the afternoon faded toward evening, and Victor found himself making phone calls again, but this time not about mergers or market shares but about something that actually mattered. He called his lawyer, his property manager, his assistant, setting in motion a plan that was forming even as he spoke. He owned a small apartment building downtown, had units that sat vacant between tenants, and he arranged for Lily to have one immediately, furnished, utilities included, a place to sleep that came with a lock on the door and heat that actually worked. He called in favors to get her enrolled in a GED program, then community college, then wherever her intelligence and determination would take her. He set up a legitimate tutoring arrangement, contracted and paid, that would give her income and structure and the beginning of stability. But more than the practical arrangements, something shifted in Victor himself during those hours at the park. Emma sat between him and Lily, asking questions and listening to answers, completely unconcerned with the differences in their circumstances, seeing only a person who knew things worth knowing, who could teach lessons worth learning. His daughter's unself-conscious acceptance reminded Victor of the man he'd been before wealth had insulated him from reality, before success had given him permission to stop seeing people who couldn't help his bottom line. Lily cried when she understood what he was offering, when she realized this wasn't temporary kindness or conditional assistance but a genuine chance to rebuild the life that had been torn from her through no fault of her own. She told him she'd work hard, that she wouldn't waste this opportunity, that she'd prove herself worthy of his investment, and Victor found himself saying something he hadn't planned, that she didn't need to prove anything, that her worth wasn't conditional on her productivity or gratitude, that she deserved stability and safety simply because she was a human being who'd been failed by systems that should have protected her. The weeks that followed transformed all of them in ways Victor hadn't anticipated. Lily moved into the apartment and slowly began to look like the teenager she actually was rather than the street-hardened survival machine circumstances had forced her to become. She gained weight, her eyes lost the haunted wariness of constant vigilance, her intelligence flourished when given the nourishment of safety and opportunity. She tutored Emma 3 times a week, and Victor found himself sitting in on the sessions, rediscovering literature he'd forgotten in his single-minded pursuit of wealth, learning from this girl who'd been discarded by society that value couldn't be measured in bank accounts. Emma flourished under Lily's teaching in ways that made Victor realize how much his daughter had been starving for authentic connection, for education that came from passion rather than obligation, for relationship with someone who treated her as a person rather than a client. The bond between them was beautiful and slightly heartbreaking, the homeless girl and the billionaire's daughter finding in each other what money had failed to provide, the basic human need to be seen and valued for who you are rather than what you have. Victor started visiting the shelters Lily had stayed in, the soup kitchens where she'd eaten, the streets where she'd slept, no longer as a donor writing checks from a distance but as someone who actually showed up, who learned names and stories, who began to understand that homelessness wasn't a failure of character but a failure of systems, of safety nets with holes too large, of a society that had decided some people were disposable. He redirected his philanthropic efforts from galas and photo opportunities to actual solutions, funding housing first initiatives, supporting education programs for homeless youth, using his wealth and influence to address root causes rather than symptoms. If this story has moved you, if you believe that every person deserves a chance regardless of their circumstances, if you've been reminded that the most valuable lessons often come from unexpected teachers, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment about what this story meant to you, and sharing it with others who need to hear that kindness and opportunity can transform lives. Please type, "Everyone deserves a chance," in the comments if you believe in the power of second chances and the dignity of every human life. 6 months after that afternoon in the park, Victor sat in the audience at the community college as Lily gave a presentation on literacy programs for homeless youth, her voice confident and clear, her ideas sharp and well-researched, and he felt a pride that had nothing to do with monetary return on investment and everything to do with witnessing a human being reclaim the future that had been stolen from her. Emma sat beside him, beaming with the special joy of watching someone you believe in succeed, and Victor understood that his daughter had learned more from Lily than literature and analysis. She'd learned that people were more than their circumstances, that wisdom could come from unexpected places, that privilege carried responsibility to those who'd been denied it through no fault of their own. The girl who'd been teaching his daughter on a patch of grass in a public park had taught Victor something far more valuable, had reminded him that wealth without compassion was poverty of a different kind, that success measured only in dollars was failure of imagination and spirit, that the most important investment anyone could make was in the human potential that society was so quick to waste. Lily had her future back now, was building toward the teaching career she'd dreamed of, but more than that, she'd helped Victor and Emma find something they'd lost without realizing it, the connection to humanity that made life worth living, the understanding that we're all responsible for each other, that the measure of a society isn't in its billionaires but in how it treats those who have nothing, and that sometimes the people we think we're saving are actually the ones saving us from the isolation and emptiness that comes from forgetting that behind every statistic of poverty is a person who matters, who has value, who deserves the chance to become everything they were meant to be.